Lopez was then confronted by a military policewoman in a parking lot where he killed himself with a shot to the head. In Washington Thursday, Secretary of the Army John McHugh told the Senate Armed Services Committee Lopez was being evaluated for post-traumatic stress disorder and had sought treatment for a traumatic brain injury allegedly suffered after a brief non-combatant tour in Iraq.
We had no indication on the record of that examination that there was any sign of likely violence either to himself or to others. He was undergoing a variety of treatment and diagnoses for mental health conditions ranging from depression to anxiety to some sleep disturbance. He was prescribed a number of drugs to address those, including Ambien.
For more, I'm joined from Cleveland, Ohio by Dr. Joseph Calabrese. He's a principal investigator in a 10-year PTSD study funded by the Department of Defense. He's also the director of the Mood Disorders Program at Cleveland's University Hospital's Case Medical Center. Good to have you with us, Doctor. According to the Veterans Administration, between 11 and 20% of returning Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans have come home with PTSD, and close to 250,000 veterans have been treated for the ailment in VA hospitals over the past 10 years. I think you'd agree it's important to say that people who have PTSD rarely are violent toward other people?
Well, that's entirely accurate. But, you know, Antonio, the real message here is that when somebody suicides, in almost all instances, 85 to 90% of people who suicide, they have a psychiatric illness. And it's not necessarily PTSD. You know, PTSD rarely occurs by itself. In almost all instances, PTSD is accompanied by other things, like depression or anxiety or alcohol abuse. So this kind of complexity is usually not a part of the story here. And people have to understand that this is a much more complex situation than it's being talked about.
Well, in fact, it is very complex because PTSD is not easily diagnosed. The shooter had not been formally diagnosed with it. What are the signs and the symptoms of someone who has PTSD, and how treatable is it?
Well, I understand that's important, Antonio, but the message here, it's not about the symptoms of PTSD. It's about whether or not PTSD is accompanied by other illnesses. When PTSD is accompanied by other illnesses like depression or anxiety or alcohol abuse, that's when somebody who is thinking about suicide attempts suicide. So the issue isn't so much the symptoms of PTSD, but how it presents with other illnesses.
But then that's the big question in this case, is that it did seemingly present with other issues. When then does a psychologist have to take action, or when can a psychologist take action and say, Army, you should watch out, this person should not be on active duty?
Well, the point I'm making is that if somebody has PTSD by itself, that's not so much of a problem. This becomes an issue when there are other illnesses accompanied by it. When people have other problems on top of PTSD, that's when somebody begins to think about suicide and attempts suicide. So that's not common. That's not unique to the military.
Right, but in this case, at least according to the Secretary of the Army, there were other issues involved. So my question to you as a doctor is, when can doctors take action to say, hey, we should be careful in this case? Although, again, we should say that in this case, there are many reports that there were no indications of kind of inclination toward violence.
I understand. The first answer to that question is the co-occurrence of other illnesses should alarm a physician or a doctor to be alert about the possibility of suicide. And the second answer to that question is that when somebody begins to articulate thoughts about hopelessness or helplessness or worthlessness, that's an indication to you that that person is at increased risk for a suicide attempt.
And in this case, he also as we said, reportedly claimed that he had traumatic brain injury, but the Army says that there is no indication in their records that that had ever happened to him. Should that have been a red flag, that he was raising things that may not have happened?
Well, that's a possibility. Mild traumatic brain injury is a common experience for people who've been deployed and have experienced trauma. And frequently what happens during those situations that people get disinhibited and do things impulsively, quickly, without thinking about the consequences. So that's also an important consideration.
So many questions in this terrible tragedy. Dr. Joseph Calabrese, appreciate you joining us tonight to talk about it. Thank you.
Okay.
Switching topics now to a U.S. program to use a Twitter-like social media project to undercut Cuba's government. According to an Associated Press